Hello. My name is David. Tonight I'm going to use my own story, my own history, as a way of talking about some other important things. So I'd like to get some sense of who you all are and why you're here. Usually I go around the class and do that, but whatever this is a big number to do that. It would take us, probably the first third of our session. So I'm going to pick a row, which is this one over the third one there, and ask each of you to give me your name and and what you're going to be doing after school, after you graduate, if you know. And then what is the most interesting thing you've seen or learned about in the class, in this class this year? Some sense of it. So let me see, can we start with you in the light purple?
My name's Allie, and after I graduate from here, I'm probably going back to school.
Okay, and where are you from?
I'm from upstate New York, Corning.
Okay.
And then, I don't know, we've learned a lot of interesting things. I think we covered like a death and dying unit, and that was really good. I know like it's different to look at it from a medical perspective, like, from just a personal perspective.
Yeah. Was there one thing, tiny thing that stood out for you in the death and dying?
I can't think of anything in particular, but I like our readings. So.
I'm Laura, and I started to be doing when I graduate is taking a gap year probably in Latin America, but I want to be a PA. And I guess something in regards to what Allie was saying, like I found our death and dying section really fascinating, just learning about how differently everyone thinks of death and the perspective of the doctor as well as the patient. Like I never really thought about it that much, and so it was really interesting.
Yeah, we're not exposed to death much as Americans. Okay, well, that's as many as we can do for death or dying, so the rest of you have to come up with something else.
My name is Molly, and after I graduate, I would like to go to med school. And I think the most interesting thing, or the thing that stands out to me the most, is when we had a man with HIV come in and talk to us.
And do you remember something specific that kind of stood out for you? Too much
Sorry.
Well, that's all right. Thank you.
My name is Carolina, and I hope to go to medical school after I graduate. And probably the most interesting thing about this class for me has been we've read a bunch of stories about particular people, and I like to learn about their families and how their families have, reacted to their conditions and how it affects everybody, not just that person or the doctor.
Yeah. Now, you guys have read Medical Associates, right? Some of you have. Mm-hmm. So did you read the chapter about our family?
No, not yet. I haven't finished yet.
Okay.
My name's Kim. I plan to go to medical school after I graduate. I think that the most interesting topic so far has been our section on autistic people and how they live in society and more about their lives.
Did you have someone with autism come in and talk with you?
Yes, we did. It was interesting.
Yeah.
My name is Danielle, and I plan on going to med school as well. And I also thought that the topic or the discussions about autism were most interesting because I think that we looked at it from a different point of view than I had ever done before.
Was there something surprising about autism that you learned about autism that you didn't know?
The way that the people think and how it's so differently than how I think. That was so cool.
Yeah, I just learned about it the last couple of years too, and it's just astonishing.
My name is Nora. I also plan to go to medical school. And then I guess out of all the topics, one of the most interesting for me is just the idea of how, even though a doctor they have to know a lot of things. They're also an advocate for their patients, and I thought that was really interesting how in every single topic it's so different, but that's still kind of like a
My name is Kara. I would like to go to physical therapy school after graduating, and I really like learning about AIDS in Africa. It was really interesting.
Was there anything particular that you remember that you found new or interesting?
I don't know. I guess just how many people are affected there and how much it impacts their community.
I have a friend from Uganda, and it's got, just kind of astonishing to talk with her. Okay, well, thank you. My first practice, I went up to a very small town in northeastern Minnesota on the North Shore of Lake Superior. And I went there for two reasons, really. One was that it was an incredibly beautiful area. It was in the Boundary Waters canoe area, and so there was just a lot of wilderness up there. And, I like cold winters and Minnesota summers. I could cross-country ski to work, which was kind of unique. So it was a very beautiful place. The second reason I went up there was that I wanted to practice in a place where not everybody had the best access to medical care. And the particular county that we were in, there was a Indian reserve on one end of the county, and then a plant that was kind of closing and open intermittently. So there were a fair number of people who were just kind of living very precariously. And I chose to do that because lots of people don't have access to medical care. I couldn't figure out why, as a physician, I would go someplace where everybody else wanted to go if there were places that really needed me. So that was really, at least, very important to my going there. I was aware of the huge disparity in medical care in the country. I'm sure that that's one thing that you look at here too. The differentials in, for instance, by race in terms of the results are really quite astonishing in terms of access to care, and do it also by class. And that's always something that seemed wrong to me. So part of going to a place where there are poor people is that it seems that I wanted to be a part of bringing some level of justice to places. I also wanted to do the kind of medical work that country doctors do. Country doctoring is one of the few forms of doctoring where you just do everything. It's sort of like the old-time doctoring. It's not a narrow specialty. But, I eventually found it overwhelming, actually. I couldn't, it's one of the reasons I left. But it's a very exciting way to practice. One of the things that I remember very specifically from my rural practice was that every physician I knew, including all the specialists who we referred to down in Duluth, cared for indigent patients. Anyone, we could refer anyone anywhere, and all of primary care doctors, we could refer to them. And they all had sliding scales of some sort, and would see people who couldn't pay. That was just, at that time and in those places, that was simply expected. There wasn't any question about it. I mean, in our tiny town, if we hadn't taken care of somebody who couldn't pay, we'd have been banned from the town or excommunicated or something. It was just what you did. And so it was a real shock when I came to Washington to discover that there were lots of doctors who didn't do that. And the reasons for that became clear after a little while. But that was something I remember being quite different in a small town. I loved the wilderness there. The people in the town were great. I had great relationships with them. I had good partners. And I found myself overwhelmed by the work. Part of it was being a country doctor, and you just had to know so much. Anybody coming into your office could have anything, and mostly it was kind of minor stuff, but you always had to be ready for something really important. And then what was worse is that a lot of times you had to do something about it, even though you weren't particularly qualified to do something. We had to do cesarean sections up in our clinic because we were 110 miles away, and from the nearest obstetrician. I got some training in doing cesarean sections, but I certainly wasn't an accomplished surgeon. But once a year, twice a year, we had to do them. I remember putting in a pacemaker because the cardiologist 120 miles away said, you have to put it in, or this man's going to die. Well, I'd seen a pacemaker put in once. I'd never done it. That kind of experience of having to do stuff that was well beyond the limits of my competence was simply too much for me. I expect that's changed now with virtual connections, but it was overwhelming for me. There were also some emotional parts of medicine in a small town that were, or just medicine in general, that were difficult for me. The idea of that you had to play God in some sense, that there were decisions that physicians had to make that were life and death decisions, and really, in some cases, could not be made with the help of the patients for very different reasons. And so, while I didn't like playing God, that kind of God, sometimes I felt extraordinarily uncomfortable with stuff like that. Second reason that I found it very difficult to do was that you cannot meet people's expectations. People often come into your clinic with one thing that they tell you is wrong, but if you really listen carefully, you'll find out that there are other things that are wrong too. So for the patient, they came in with one thing, and that thing maybe got treated or maybe didn't, but they go out with one thing. For the doctor, they come in with one thing, at least for me, they come in with one thing, and I may have helped that, but then I could see 5 or 10 other things that kind of were walking out the door that I wasn't able to help with. And so there was this sense of sometimes of beating my head against the wall. But finally, it was the thing that I think many of you read about, the issue of mistakes. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in a second. The history of that article is that after 7 years in Minnesota in the country practice, I burned out. I really couldn't continue practicing there. So we left and went to Finland, which is where my wife's from. And I took a year's sabbatical. I knew I couldn't continue medicine if I didn't take some time away. So while we were there, I was the house husband. I kind of took care of the kids while my wife worked. And while we were there, I realized that these things that I needed to explore, these issues that had driven me from practice. So I began writing using stories mostly. And so that story that you heard or read at the beginning of the mistakes article is one of those stories that have just kind of stayed with me. And so I needed to look at some of those stories like that and like other ones to help me understand why I left. What was it that kind of pushed me out of what was otherwise such a wonderful practice? So that's where that article came from, and it was actually part of the book that contained, looked at other aspects of the sort of contradictions of a physician's life. I sent the article in on the mistakes, and the New England Journal, which is where it was published, took a long time to decide whether or not they were going to publish it. I sent in a previous article and I got back a response in 2 months or something. This one was 7 or 8 months before I heard anything from them, so I just figured they were going to ignore it. Well, I finally got a call from the editor of the New England Journal, who at that time had been editor for 150 years or something, and was very famous. And so he calls me and he says, in this kind of gravelly voice, Dr. Hilfiker, we think your article is a good article and we'd like to publish it. But we'd like you to think about it a little, because this could be very destructive to your career. The mistakes you made were real mistakes. That may be a problem for you. These weren't things that any physician would have done under the circumstances. This wasn't a place where you did the right thing, but you got bad results. You shouldn't have done that. You should have been more prepared or something. This was a mistake. I told them I really knew it was a mistake, and given the kind of practice I had, there really wasn't much damage that could be done to my reputation in the medical field. I was not planning on moving up a ladder. I was practicing in the inner city at the time, so there wasn't really any advancement that I was looking for. So they published it, and there were about 150 letters that came in response, which is quite a few for them. Almost all of them were positive letters. Many, there were more people who were connected with physicians, spouses and nurses and other people who wrote to the journal than actual physicians. So they were also deeply affected by these mistakes that their spouses and partners had made. There were 2 negative responses, both from 2 obstetricians who just sort of understandably excoriated me for the mistakes I made. But the issue was that there were a lot of people who wrote in saying something like this happened to me, or to my husband, or to the guy I'm working for, or whatever. This has been devastating. Thank you for the articles. Well, that article came out in 1984, and about 8 or 10 years later, I went back and looked in the Index Medicus. I don't even know if do they have the Index Medicus anymore, Rita? Or do they use computers?
Online.
Pardon? Okay.
You can look online.
Anyway, it's a place where you can look up all the medical articles that have been written forever. And so I looked in the Index Medicus, and in the previous 10 years since my article had been written, there had not been another single article on mistakes written by physicians, and almost none otherwise. It was like the article had gotten swallowed. The topic had gotten swallowed, and was not something that the profession was yet prepared to deal with, talk about. That's changed some in the past 15 years or so that now there's some work being done in the field, but still, in talking with physicians, that's an area that is exceedingly difficult for people to talk about. So, I'd like to stop and just ask for any questions that you might have, or any comments, things that were interesting to you in the article, things that you'd like to look at more. Yeah.
Did medical school prepare you at all to do some of the surgeries that you had to do?
Well, you don't learn much surgery in medical school. It's really, in my case, it was just a year-long internship. And no, I got no preparation. Well, I should say that's not true. I got some preparation. I actually went down to work with a obstetrician, but only for 6 weeks. So I got the basics of the procedure. I performed a number of them, but not really enough. I mean, you have to spend a year or 2 in order to really be able to take care of everything that might happen. So we just did them under emergency circumstances.
So how did you buy books, get medical texts on how to do those surgeries? And
No, it was the experience of being with a doctor, and then making very explicit notes about what we've done, and then talking to the doctors kind of regularly on the phone about afterwards, or beforehand, about what needed to be done to this place. Now again, today you wouldn't even be allowed to, so that's not a concern. And this comes out of the prehistoric ages. But similar things are still, still true. You're still in a rural area. You still have to practice beyond your competence. Yeah.
So many physicians these days are afraid of lawsuits if they admit their mistakes.
Yeah.
So what do you think are ways of getting around that?
I don't know. I think the research, you have to help me read if there's research on this. At least in my own experience, telling people about the mistake is one of the best ways to prevent a suit. A lot of suits have to do with anger, with the doctor did this, the assumption is he doesn't care. And coming back to the person saying, this is what I did, really sorry, I messed up here, and what can we do to go on from here? That's seems pretty paltry in light of what I did in a couple of those cases. But I've been sued twice, and both times, for particular reasons, I didn't know that I had made a mistake, or I'd been perceived as having made a mistake. And so I didn't go back and talk to people. And all of a sudden I get this summons. So has there been any research about that, Rita? Do you know whether telling people about mistakes is a good idea?
The relationship between the physician and the patient, I'm Rita again.
A physician also.
The relationship between the physician and the patient is the strongest predictor of lawsuits. And in general, honesty and forthrightness and no mistakes is recommended.
So would you have done it? Would you have gone up and talked to Barb about what you just done? Yeah.
I feel like initially I would be really reluctant to tell someone about the mistake, but then I feel like that it would eventually be too, like, having that on your conscience and not having told the person, I feel like is a lot worse than them not knowing. So I think in the end, I can't put myself in the situation. I know what I did, but I'd like to think that I would tell the person.
As it was mentioned, a lot of physicians are under the impression if they talk to their patients about it, they'll just get sued. And the advice you'll get, the official, at least from your insurance company, is do not tell the patient what happened. And yet, for me, like you, for me, it's just, how do you not tell a person? Not for them, but for yourself. How about others? Are there folks that you wouldn't tell? Yeah.
Oh, I would
Whatever.
say that
Yeah.
tell your patients. I was just thinking that how you mentioned like physicians.
Can people hear him back? Okay. Why don't you stand up and talk?
It's okay. I'll just be louder.
Okay. If you can't hear him back, please say something while people talk louder or whatever. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I thought it was very interesting how you mentioned sometimes physicians have to play God, and in essence, people are okay with that when they're getting the results that they want. But when the doctors or the physicians, when they make a mistake, they become sometimes very angry because God don't make mistakes, and it's because you're a human, they have opportunity to kind of punish you in a sense or get back at you for doing what you did to them.
Yeah, when you're making, when people think you're acting like God, then if you make a mistake, people are pretty pissed at it. And like I said, sometimes you have to anyway. But at least under those circumstances, you can explain to the patient why it's happening, why I had to do this.
Can you provide a specific example of the time you felt like you were playing God?
Sure, a surgeon does all the time. You get in there and something goes screwy, and you have to make certain decisions about life and death, about how to do this. The patient can't help you at all. Another time it happens, that happened to me quite often, is that frequently patients cannot understand the kind of statistical way of thinking that a doctor has to think. You know, here's the side effects. It happens 0.4% of the time. If you say this side effect is going to happen to you 0.4% of the time, usually people say, well, I don't want to do it then. If you tell them that there's 99.6% chance that nothing will happen, they'll say, oh, okay, we're fine. So talking about this statistic there doesn't really help them. And there are all these side effects that could happen. So, you know, if you look in the side effects list of any medication, there are these hundreds of medications. Well, as a physician, your job is to go through and kind of sift that stuff and decide which are important and which not. And that's a judgment call. It always is. And, you know, your patient can come back and say, you know, why didn't you tell me about that? It says right here that that was a side effect. So that's another kind of issue. So it's kind of an example. Yeah.
Just going back to Barb, do you feel like you were more, like you felt better about telling her because you had a better relationship with her?
Did I feel better about telling her?
Like, did you feel like it was going to go more easily, I guess?
She was actually a next door neighbor. I didn't put that in the article. But, yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I didn't know her. She was next door, but I didn't really know her that well. But I actually had confidence in most people in my little town. I just, you know, not necessarily, obviously, but if you were honest with people, they were. So I don't think it was particularly Barb like this, to answer your specific question.
And was there one, like, specific case or event that really made you want to leave, or just was it the build?
No, it was the build-up of stuff. It turns out, and I was going to get to this later, but it turns out that I have a pretty severe clinical depression, which is now well treated with medications, but at that time I didn't even recognize what was going on. And so while I didn't know it then, I thought I was just kind of overwhelmed by these issues. The depression was playing a large part of it as well, especially since I didn't realize it. And doctors are often the last ones to realize what the problems are. So I didn't figure that out until about 10 years later. It was time to leave. I had to leave medicine, actually, because of the depression, because of the interaction with the two.
Do you think that the depression had anything to do with like how well you were practicing medicine? Do you think that that like made it worse, or do you think that you were still just equally as good of a doctor if you?
I think I was a better doctor because of it.
Really?
Surprisingly, yeah. I think as one of the things that depression did to me was to make me a lot more sensitive to the pain that other people were feeling. And I really noticed this in the inner city when people would come in with just enormous pain. And what I've been told is that people can kind of see that or feel it in me. And I'm pretty sure it was the depression. In my case, you know, some people are really disabled by their depression. I wasn't really. I could operate, I could practice with an unimpaired, there was one time when I was not sure, but ordinarily with an unimpaired judgment. So I didn't lose anything, and I think I've gained that kind of sensitivity over the years because of the depression. So for me, it was helpful. I mean, I trade it. I would, if somebody else wants to take it, I'd give it away. But no, it's really a part of me, part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between a mistake and negligence? What do you? That's obviously you can't do that. What do you think? How would you differentiate those two things?
Basically, a mistake is unintentional, and negligence is when you know that there's a problem, but you wait for a while until you think
Okay,
it works.
that's certainly a part of it. Another part of it that you can think of. So, you know, negligence is to some degree intentional and mistake isn't.
I associate negligence with like carelessness, like you're not, being careful what you're doing, so you mess up.
Carelessness. Yeah, that's a kind of a tricky one because you can always kind of look back at your mistake and say you were careless about even a mistake. You know, for instance, when I palpated Barb's uterus, just before I did the DNC, I can remember in retrospect that it was too big. I should have noticed it. Is that carelessness or not? I'm not sure. But, so that's a good question. Is it, to what degree is it carelessness? Negligence, I think most people agree, something ought to happen to you. Ought to be a professional review of what you've done to make sure you're competent to continue being a doctor. I think a mistake may or may not be, depending on its seriousness. Yeah.
When I think about those two words, I think about like what happens afterward, like
Okay.
after the situation
Yeah.
has happened. And if you can go back and like have a conscience for it and say like, if I could have went back, I would have did that differently, and I
Yeah.
feel bad for not doing it the
Yeah.
right way, then I think that's a mistake. But
Okay.
if you can look at it and just be like, well, things happen, and it's just I overlooked it, blah blah blah, and not really have sort of a conscience, like or
Okay.
some feeling of regret toward it. I think that's negligence.
So it really depends on what your attitude
Yeah.
what your attitude is toward it.
Yeah, I think it's your attitude afterward, how you respond to
Okay.
it.
Okay.
I think you can still feel really guilty if you were negligent. Like, I feel like negligent, I kind of think neglect. So it's kind of like you just weren't really paying that close attention because you didn't think it was a big deal.
Yeah.
But then you can always go back and be like, oh my gosh, like I feel awful about it. I feel very
Yeah, part of the problem, I think, is that it's really, really, really difficult to separate those things out. On the end of it, it's fairly easy. If you're a person who continues to make mistakes or continues to do things that they shouldn't have done, or is aware of an area in which you're not really competent and then continue on to do that. Or what's often happens is, a doctor in a hospital or practice, other doctors will see that something's happening to you. And at least this was the case, they won't say anything until, unless it becomes really obvious, but they won't. For instance, if people are getting older and perhaps an early dementia is happening. I remember I was in a clinic in which, to me, it was obvious that the guy was, one of the practitioners was very obvious, and his partners hadn't confronted him and pushed him out of the. So that would, the partners there would, I think, be guilty of negligence. Or if the doctor himself knew about the likelihood that he was going to cause a problem, I would consider that obvious negligence. But this other place, sort of where it shades into mistake, that's a really difficult one. Which is part of the problem for lay people, because lay people frequently think you ought to know more than you do. The other thing about suits in particular is that in this country, the way suits are done, a jury makes the decision, and basically if the results were really, really, really bad, juries will feel like there ought to be some compensation to this people, which is true. Unfortunately, the only way you can really get compensation in this country is to sue the doctor. So if you have a kid who's born with very severe cerebral palsy, almost no insurance company will allow you to respond to that in court. They'll always try to get a settlement, because the chances of going to court and having the jury say, this person needs to be compensated is too high, and we're going to rule that the doctor was negligent. That's a fault with our legal system that doesn't exist in other countries because they structure it differently. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'd like to talk a little bit about, as an introduction to my practice in the inner city, a little bit about the issue of privilege, and specifically our privilege, the fact that you're here, the fact for many of you that you're going to become medical professionals, some of you become doctors. This puts you quite a ways above most people, and gives you a kind of privilege that the question is, do I have responsibilities because of my privilege? We live in a world in which privilege is divided up very unequally. So in this country, for instance, the top 1% of the population, last I checked, owned 43% of the wealth in the country, which is double what it was about 20 years ago. Over the last 30 years, the wages of blue-collar and pink-collar laborers has actually declined over that period, real wages, while the wages of the people who are in the upper 50% have gone up, and the people in the upper 10% have done very well over the last 30 years in terms of wages. So we're people who, for whatever reason, have a great deal of privilege. This next statement is certainly open to debate. It's part of what we're going to be talking about, but it's my belief that a lot of the reason for that differential in privilege has to do with the structures of society. In other words, for instance, in most countries, my wife's country, Finland, if you are wealthy when you die, at least half of your income is taxed. The idea is that that kind of wealthy privilege should not be passed on from generation to generation. The people ought to start out basically equal. In our country, there's no guarantee that you're going to go to schools that are anywhere near as good as other people. In our country, there is still a great deal of racial discrimination that is not obvious. Well, it's obvious if you're African American, but it's not obvious on the surface. So there are, and I could go into others, there are structures in our society that are in many ways responsible for this privilege. So then the question becomes, how do we make sense of our position? If we have these privileges, how are we supposed to respond if we live in a society where privilege has been divided up so unequally? So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with people who've been on the short end of the stick, and then we can kind of talk about the larger question. I came to the inner city of Washington for a couple of reasons. One, I was coming to a clinic, and so I thought that the work wasn't going to be as intense as the work in Graham Way, because at a clinic you really are responsible for maybe 10% of. I didn't do any C-sections, didn't do any surgery, didn't set any bones, didn't go to the hospital even to take care of very ill patients. My clinic practice was quite circumscribed, which I thought would be easier for me. So that was the main reason. The other reasons were really had to do spiritual reasons, which I won't get into any detail, but for me, coming to the inner city, working with very poor people, was about finding a closer relationship with God. for me and my beliefs. God is especially close to the impoverished. So that was coming to Washington. I started in a small clinic. I mentioned that, not all this is. It's called Community Hope. And I was really shocked to discover how thoroughly these folks had been abandoned by our society. It wasn't just that they were poor. It's just that they had abandoned. One of the first, I think I mentioned this in the book, one of the first things I noticed was that you could be as poor as dirt and still not be eligible for Medicaid. In fact, not eligible for any kind of medical assistance. Medicaid covers, this is going to change now, hopefully, with this new Affordable Care Act, but Medicaid covers about a third of very poor people, which means 2/3 aren't covered. That differs from state to state, exactly what's covered and what isn't. In DC, they have very, very good coverage if you're eligible. But the only people who are eligible are families with small children and people who are completely disabled. So if you don't fit in one of those categories, it doesn't matter how little money you have. If you're on the streets, you aren't eligible for any kind of medical insurance. For me, that feels like abandonment. Homeless families began kind of surging in, this was in the 80s, began surging into the clinic. We really didn't have a whole lot of homelessness before the early 80s. Our clinic had a sort of small shelter upstairs in which we took care of homeless families in which the mothers were addicted to crack most of the time. We went around and did a little survey of them, and it turned out that as far as we could tell, about 70% of those women had been abused, either sexually or physically, when they were children. I mean, huge percentage. So if you're going to draw the conclusion, a lot of what goes into becoming a crack addict is not just a choice that people make, but has to do with how the circumstances, how they grew up. It turns out at that time there were no services available for them to get assistance with their addiction. DC budgets are small, and while there were some kinds of services for addicts, there weren't very many. In those particular circumstances, there were no resources. Abandoned by our society. Basic education was unbelievably poor. We had one young woman, again, I can't remember what I put in the book, but I think Margine was her name. A young woman who was put in a special class because she failed 3rd grade. And in that special class were all the students in the whole elementary school who had failed a grade. So kids from 7 years old to 12 years old were in the same class because they failed a grade. Our social worker went to visit. The teacher of that class acknowledged that she couldn't do any teaching really. She was just babysitting. So that was my patient's elementary school experience. Hardly a wonder that she dropped out of school as quickly as she could. And that inner city schools are, with few exceptions, are simply much worse than suburban and wealthy schools. There are a lot of different reasons for that we could go into, but it's just, there are exceptions, but in most cases this is really true. Welfare, if you could get it, was unbelievably stingy. There is, at least at that time, there was no welfare anyplace that brought you up to the poverty level. And by law, you weren't allowed to make any other money or get any other money anyplace either. So if you got a welfare payment, then it was below the poverty level, so you really couldn't afford to live that way. And your boyfriend brought in an extra $200 a month for you. If the welfare people found out about it, that was welfare fraud. So essentially, and there have been studies about this, every person who was on welfare, this has changed a little bit with the new act, but at that time, every person who was on welfare, every woman, was committing welfare fraud because you couldn't live otherwise. And again, there's a whole book that's been written on that topic. So when you looked around, the abandonment of these folks was just really clear. How do you make it when that's the environment you grew up in? And the results are incredible. The black infant mortality rate is 2.5 times the white infant mortality rate, and that's growing. And in the black infant mortality rate is also included affluent African Americans. So we're not just talking about poor people, but overall. And so I don't know exactly what the figure is, but presumably for poor African Americans, it's much higher. But in any case, 2.5 times higher. Black women are twice as likely to die from cervical cancer as are white women. The incidence of AIDS among black men is 9 times higher than among white men. The incidence of AIDS among black women is 18 times higher than white men. I'll come back to that when we talk about the prison system. So the impact, and those are just the medical impact, the impact on, well, for instance, wealth. The amount of wealth that people have, white people have, on the average, over 10 times as much wealth as all black people. And as I say, we'll cover that a little bit more. Okay, so some questions. Oh, first of all, questions that you might have.
I just wanted to ask about the drug rehab program that you said was incorporated. Did you see any significant success with that? Because I know that the success rate of any addiction program is very, very low, but considering they likely didn't have anywhere else to go except the streets, and you have people coming back, or did you hear about them relapsing?
Sure, as you say, there's no treatment that's great, but treatment does work for a number of people. And yes, we saw, but what we did see quite a few people who went through treatment. Unfortunately, inpatient treatment disappeared in about the mid-'80s in Washington for indigent people. So the only treatment you could get was outpatient. But even then, certainly the inpatient treatment would help. Again, maybe 25, maybe 35%. Frequently, people had to go multiple times. We had one guy I remember go, I'm sure he was never going to get clean. And we sent him to treatment, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 times. Came back and he's been clean ever since. And that's not a really unusual story. The story I tell at the beginning of the book about, I forget what I called him, in the first chapter about the guy who, what was his name in the book? Anybody remember? Anyway, I just saw him a couple days ago. He has been sober now for about 10 years. That guy who, there was no chance that he was going to get sober. He's now been sober for 10 years. So, yeah.
Just out of curiosity, where in DC was this?
We're in DC. I was practicing in Columbia Heights,
Okay.
and Christ House and Joseph's House are in Adams Morgan.
Okay.
So it's that area. Columbia Heights used to be much poorer than it is now. It's gentrifying very quickly. So. Well, let me ask you this. Does a doctor have any special responsibility to help make sure that poor people get at least a modicum of health care? Does a doctor have a special responsibility to decrease the inequality in the medical system? Yeah.
I think doctors will definitely be more passionate about it because they're experiencing it more firsthand than other people are.
Okay, so doctors experience more of it firsthand, and so will be more passionate about it. Do you think they ought to? So an ethical question.
It would help more. I
Okay.
don't know about, that it would take their time away from actually helping people, perhaps.
Uh-huh.
So, it depends.
Okay? Other folks? Yeah.
I mean, I definitely think they should, but as in your book, you point out a lot, it's difficult to like find at what point that ends. Like in the ER or in the hospital, one of your stories, like they treat one of the patients with like the oozing leg, and they just discharge him, and it's difficult. Like where exactly should they like stop treating him and like stop finding him somewhere to go,
Right.
or something like that.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so when you, I guess what you're saying is right. I'm thinking not only about actually coming in and treating people, although that's certainly a big thing that you can do. But I'm just wondering whether we as physicians, assuming I know some of you are going to be PT people and nurses and others, but do we as a medical profession have some responsibility to change the structures of our society so that everybody receives adequate medical care? Is that a special responsibility that we have?
If I understand the question correctly, I'm thinking more about like if a physician were to treat someone and then were to give them, pills and tell them like, here's a diet for you, you have to, eat this way, sleep this way, blah, blah, blah. And a poor person don't have those resources or even a house or, somewhere to make sure they're properly healed or whatever. And they have to keep continuing like going back to the doctor, and the doctor's like not wasting their time but doing the same sort of things, and the patient isn't getting better because of their situation, their living situation. So I think in a way, just to not waste their time, so to say, it would be helpful, and it'll probably save a lot of different a lot of the same treatments or the same type of surgeries. Or
It would be helpful to what?
it would be helpful to help it would be helpful to help the poor people living situation.
Right. The question is, though, do physicians have because of we're healthcare professionals, do we have a special responsibility within society to help change the medical system so that it's more just?
Oh, see, I didn't understand the question.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
That's why I'm clarifying. So what do you think?
This is a lot coming at once right now. I'm just gonna step back and then recuperate.
Come back.
I would say no, but unless maybe you have like a specific high-up position on a board and that's like what you're interested in, then,
Okay.
and good for you, but I don't think everyone, like all positions have that responsibility.
Right. Other people? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say yes, just because I feel like nobody
Can everybody hear, by the way, in the back? Okay.
Yeah, I kind of lost my voice. But I would say yes because I don't think anybody else would. I think healthcare professionals are probably the best and probably the only outlet for something to change.
Yeah.
Okay, going back to the question, I think they should have a responsibility or take responsibility because they are in the position to. Like they're the people in the best position to do it, because people are dependent on them to give care to other people and make sure people live long. Will help the process of living longer, being more healthy, and helping aid in that process. And so because they're held to that standard of helping somebody kind of take care of themselves and save people's lives, so to speak, like they should be held responsible to change the way the medical thing is set up.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I think they should take responsibility, and anybody with resources who is able to should also take responsibility to try and change it, but I don't think we can force them to or tell them they have to, but
Yeah.
it's something that they would have to decide
Right.
to do.
Yeah, I'm talking about a kind of sense of responsibility.
Yeah, but I think they should.
Yeah. This is a huge issue, by the way. It's not settled at all, obviously, among you, and it's not settled professionally. One of the reasons it gets, I think the issue gets kind of easily dismissed is that on the one hand, you say, well, physician or healthcare worker doesn't do anything, they're not responsible for anything. On the other hand, they ought to go down the inner city and practice. Well, there's lots in between that a person can do, from volunteering to looking around their community to see if there are people who need some kind of assistance, to political activity. I mean, for instance, I think a physician had a responsibility to take a look at the Affordable Care Act last year and say, decide, look at it with some thoroughness and decide, is this going to help the medical care of the poor? And that would be an important issue in your deciding about the worth of that program. So I'm kind of suggesting that my own opinion is that we do have some responsibility, not so much because we're doctors, but because we're privileged. And that in our area where we have privilege, we have resources, capacities in the area of medicine, and so we have a lot more power to affect the system than another person might. And I'm not saying how it should be affected. This isn't a political discussion. It is to think about what would be best for the poor, and then to make your political decision about how to bring that best about. And that may be a conservative solution, it may be a liberal solution. Okay, I'm going to rush on through here. I'm going to go a little different now. I want to move into an area about the history of the Black Ghetto, which I know is kind of a specific area. The reason I want to do this in this class is that a primary reason that is given for not working for justice for the poor is the individualism that's powerful in our society. It says that poor people are poor because of decisions they made. That in some sense it's really their fault. If they'd have made the kinds of decisions that I make, they wouldn't be poor. In other words, what we need to do about poverty is make poor people better, improve them. And if you have that opinion, then your sense of society's responsibility to fix the situation is quite different. If it's really poor people's fault that they're poor, or so nearly, then society doesn't have a whole lot of responsibility to it. If you think there are social structures, a history that's created in poverty, then it should, be balanced the other way. So I want to talk about the history of the inner city ghetto. I've written a small book about this if you're interested to follow it further. So it starts way back after the Civil War, and African Americans move north because they can. And because it's right after the Civil War, a lot of the northern states and communities accept African Americans into their community. So that if you look at the U.S. Census around 1890, you'll see African Americans kind of scattered randomly all over the country. Montana, and wherever, Iowa, wherever you look. So that kind of indicating that they were allowed to go anyplace since they're kind of spread out. If you take a look at the 1930 census, it's completely changed. And now there are whole counties without a single black person in them. African Americans are now concentrated in some small villages and specific towns where only African Americans live, and especially, as we know, in the large cities. So something happened in that 40 years to go from a completely integrated society, relatively, at least in terms of where people live, to a highly segregated society. And what happened was that African Americans were run out of town. they were run out of town in a number of different ways. One of them was violence. A African American man would be accused of some crime, perhaps against a white woman, and he'd be lynched, and then the mob would head for the black part of town. And they would say, you have 24 hours to get out of here. And if you don't, we will kill you. Other times they actually would. They go in and actually shoot a couple of people before they burned the place down. And so those African Americans were expelled from perhaps land they owned and run out of town. This, by the way, this expelling what happened all across the country, but especially in the North. The South had other ways of dealing with integration, other ways of segregating, but especially in the North, this kind of thing. In other cases, it wasn't quite so dramatic as going in and burning the place down. It was threats of doing that. You heard what happened in Georgia up there. You don't get out of here in 24 hours, we're going to do the same thing to you. In other cases, it was even less dramatic. People would come into town and they'd be ignored. Or towns would pass ordinances that said it was illegal for an African American to stay there. In fact, in many cases, they made it illegal to stay overnight, which is how they kind of kept people from living there. These towns that did this are called sundown towns, because there would be a sign on either end of the town which said, "Nigger, don't let the sun go down on you," in whatever the town was. And so these were called sundown towns. Other places, people would, African Americans would come in and they'd just be ignored. No one would come to welcome them. They couldn't get their utilities turned on. The kids were ignored in school, or they couldn't get into school. Other cases, nothing would happen to the adults, but the kids would be mercilessly picked on, beat up, so that the parents couldn't stand beating them. But the end result was that there were, it's unclear, the research has just been in the last 5 or 6 years about this happening, so it's unclear what the percentage is, but probably over half of small towns and cities in the North were sundown towns. And that if you look at any small town or city that's now completely white, or almost completely white, and go back and look at its history, you'll probably find some history of sundown towns. It's just really common. And so that's how the segregation began, was just this deliberate effort to expel people. There is a book that's called Sundown Towns, coincidentally. It's about that thick, but the first chapter reviews a lot of this. So if you can get it at the library and look at the first chapter, it's really good. There's another book that's called Bury Me Beneath the Troubled Waters, that is about 9 different incidents of African Americans being violently run out of town. So I recommend either of those books if you're interested. So, early 19 teens, the First World War comes along. There are lots of jobs up north. So you have a great migration of millions of African Americans from the South into the cities where they get jobs. Because of the segregation that's now becoming rampant, they have to live basically, well, all immigrants lived near the factories, whether you were Finnish or Greek or whatever, you lived near the factories. The difference was that as the immigrants became more affluent, they could move out into white communities. Blacks were kept in those areas. So that by 1930, you had the lines of the ghettos that we're familiar with. One legal tool that was used was called restrictive covenants. And that is, whites, homeowners in an area would get together and they'd make a legal covenant with each other, which said that if we move, we cannot sell our house to an African American. And that those covenants were not declared unconstitutional until 1948. This kind of sundowning, by the way, went on for a long time, to a lesser degree. I lived and came up in a suburb near Buffalo in 1961. It was an all-white suburb, and a African-American family, upper middle class African-American family moved in. My dad was a pastor, and he invited him to church. But within a couple of weeks, there were burning crosses on their front lawns. And this was a suburb of Buffalo, New York in early 1960s. So this went on for a long time, this kind of expulsion from white communities, different communities. Get to the Great Depression, and everybody's poor. And so there are programs for the poor that are, because so many are poor, the New Deal comes into effect. You have a Social Security program that's developed. You have workers' compensation for people who lose their job that's developed. And it turns out that both of those programs and some others were not very much available to blacks. Blacks were primarily excluded. And the reason that was given was that blacks were agricultural workers and domestics at that time, primarily. And domestics and agricultural workers were not covered by the law. So whereas most whites got the advantage of this, African Americans largely didn't. The second, to my mind, even more egregious thing that happened was the Federal Housing Administration was created, and its intention was to make it possible for people to buy their own homes by having a government guarantee the bank in case the person defaulted. So you could go and apply for this guarantee. The federal government would guarantee the loan, and then the bank could loan you money at 5 or 10%. Previous to that, the banks wouldn't loan at anything less than 50%, so normal people couldn't buy a house. The reason for doing this was twofold. One is that that kind of program as houses were built, brought a lot of jobs into the area, money into the area. The second reason it was important is that middle-class people begin to acquire wealth that holds them, mostly through homeownership. The first way that people acquire wealth is through the owning of their homes. The trouble was that black people were completely excluded from this program. You've probably heard of redlining, and it came from this time. They had maps where, when they decided who was going to get this thing, and they had red lines that went around the black areas, and they just didn't give loans there. So that blacks were ineligible for this program until 1948 again, when it was declared unconstitutional. It's continued to happen for quite a number of years after that, and especially informally it happened until it still happens to some degree. So you have the 1930s when whites are getting a lot of help and the blacks are not. Same thing happened with the GI Bill, which was something that was just a powerful incentive for that generation that brought them education, and it was one of the reasons we did so well in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Much of those programs were administered by local offices, which meant that people were treated as individuals, which meant that, for instance, in the South, African Americans were even GIs were very unlikely to be approved. So there were these even federal programs that kind of continued the segregation. The thing about these ghettos that had been formed by 1930 and then continued on until the 50s was that they weren't the kind of ghettos we think of. They were well-functioning societies because they were vertically integrated. You had wealthy blacks, affluent blacks, middle-class blacks, working-class, poor blacks, all living in the same neighborhoods because they couldn't go anyplace else. And so those neighborhoods, because of the class differences, stores, and businesses, and jobs, and good schools, it was just sort of a miniature of the wider society. Their income, their resources were somewhat less because they were black, but these societies functioned well. That was up until the early 50s. And then early in the 50s, that changed. Suddenly, within 10 years, and dramatically. And it happened because of 4 different programs. One was the urban renewal, federal urban renewal program. And what urban renewal was a chance for cities to get federal money to clean up their downtowns, to raise the buildings and build new buildings that would be of a higher class. Blacks did not have much political power at the time, and so you can guess which areas of the city were chosen for urban renewal. It was to a large degree the black areas. So where people had been living in a well-functioning society, these places were now raised in different buildings put there. African Americans could not live there because of the pressures against them. They changed, and I'll get to that in a minute. And these people had to find other houses, which broke up these communities and changed the whole dynamic. The federal government decided that they needed to help this problem, and so they developed a housing program for poor people, in which they built projects for very poor African Americans and allowed them to move from these raised areas into the projects. The problem was that instead of now having a vertically integrated society, you had projects with just poor people in them. And when you select out just poor people out of a population, you're going to have problems. There's much less employment, tends to be less education, and that cycle goes on. A second thing that happened at that time was the Interstate Highway Program, which essentially did the same thing. Interstate Highway Program was built where the highways had to go through the cities. Much of the time they went through black neighborhoods, and again, destroying these highly functioning neighborhoods. A third thing that happened was both black and white flight. In 1954, the decision came down, the school segregation decision. And basically, that decision meant that you could no longer discriminate legally against African Americans in terms of housing. And so the ghettos were enormously crowded at that time because you had people coming in, they couldn't expand the boundaries. And so for many, the rent inside the ghetto, from middle class people, rent inside the ghetto, was higher than it was outside in a surrounding area. So you had this flight of middle and upper class people from the inner city. So that now, instead of having this vertically integrated, your middle class and upper class folks are all gone. Then the fourth thing was that jobs disappeared. There was a revolution happening in how manufacturing was done, which I won't go into detail, but what it meant was that manufacturing left the inner city. First it went to the suburbs, and then it went to the south, and then it went to the southwest, and then it went to China and those other places. What that meant was that African Americans without a whole lot of education used to be able to get started at a laboring job in these countries. And then over 15 years, they could move themselves up to the middle class ladder and have really good jobs. That avenue was now gone. So what you had was places where poor people only lived, places where all the money had left. There were no banks, there were no businesses except liquor stores and corner groceries and check cashing places. There were no jobs available. So in 15 years, you've gone from what had been highly functioning ghettos, but highly functioning, to ghettos as we think of them today. The point that I'd like to draw out of that is that the black ghettos were formed by forces over which the people who lived there had no control. This was not black behavior that created the ghettos. It was forces outside of their control that created them. Any specific questions about that? Or not specific? Had any of you known much of this history? Is this familiar to you? Anybody else? Okay. This is not uncommon for African Americans to know this history and for whites not to. I often have talked to black audiences about this, and almost everybody will know about this, and almost no white people know about this. It's a part of our different cultures, which is very important to recognize. I've talked to a couple of older women they can remember moving from the inner city out to nicer areas in the early 50s, part of this migration. Other questions about this, or thoughts? Okay, well, let me go ahead.
Sorry, this is a little bit off topic from what you've been talking about. Well, I mean, sort of. But I know that you talked about people being put in situations of poverty where they really honestly couldn't help it. But then you also spent some time in the book talking about how you don't get handouts.
Yeah.
But, I mean, could you kind of explain how those two beliefs sort of interact?
Sure. The issue of handouts is kind of a thorny one, okay? And I have differing opinions about it. Personally, I choose not to give money to direct money directly to people who ask it for me, because a lot of it is used for drugs and alcohol. And I just assume my money not go there. I would give money in other ways, but not there. On the other hand, I think I mentioned in the book, I was really happy when my kids decided that they wanted to give money, because that, for them, it was an expression of their sense of wanting to help another person, which I thought was really important. And I've had other people who, go around with extra dollars in their pocket because they think it's important. And I can't argue with either one. My own response is usually to ask people if they want a meal, and if they do, to go get them a meal. If I have time, which I don't always, but that's my own response. It's a very kind of touchy area. I live in an area where you get asked 4 or 5 times a day if you're walking around, so it's something that's very unusual when I got here, but it's kind of pretty used to it. Okay, well, I'll come back to this issue, because these are all historical forces. But there's one powerful force that has created the ghetto since the 60s and continues to create it to this day. And that is the criminal justice system in this country. In the last 40 years, the prison population in this country has multiplied times 7, so that it's now somewhere over 750 people per 100,000. That is the highest rate in the world by far. The next highest rate is 650 or so in the Soviet Union, and the next highest is 400 and something in Cuba. The average in Europe and Western countries is 100. In my wife's country of Finland, it's 50. So we were about the same as Europe 40 years ago. So something has happened in the last 40 years to dramatically increase our jail population. And it's not been an increase in crime rate. That stayed about the same. Actually, crime rates around the country, around the world, are relatively the same. The reason that those changes happened are a number of them. Most having to do with the political emphasis on law and order, which started, we'll get back to it if there's time, started in the 1970s as a political tactic, and continued on in the early 80s as a political tactic. And these were the drug laws that were made far, far, far harsher than they had been and they are in the other Western countries. Mandatory minimum sentencing. It used to be that when you were sentenced, the judge would sentence you to so many years and you could get out after a certain amount of good behavior time, go out on parole. So if you really had good behavior, the judge would sentence you and then you could get out if you had good behavior. It used to be that the judge could decide how much jail time he or she would give you. And the judge would make these decisions based on how rehabilitatable the judge thought you were, the situation that you came from, and any other variables that the judge thought was important about how long you should stay in jail, whether you've done the crime several times, whatever. That changed so that now the judge has almost no discretion at all. There are mandatory minimums. If a person commits a certain crime, they have to spend at least so much, which is usually about 90% of the sermon, of the sentence that was given. So mandatory minimums. I mentioned the truth in sentencing laws, which is eliminating parole. Many places, Virginia for instance, has no parole. No matter how good your behavior, you don't get out until your sentence has been served. They have these who knows what 3 strikes and you're out means? You're nodding your head?
Yeah, like you can like commit 3 crimes or whatever and get away with it, and then you go away for a long time.
Yeah. 3 felonies, and you're put away for a long time. Like, 3rd felony for one guy was stealing a bicycle. Another guy was stealing some videos. That was their 3rd felony, and they were sentenced to over 25 years because of those. And then sentences were increased, especially for drugs, but in other areas too. So the reason why we got so many more people in prison was not anything that had to do with the change in the crime rate. It had to do with the way we structured the criminal justice system. In fact, it was thought back in the early 70s that prisons would become an anachronism pretty soon. That it was much more effective to treat people in programs rather than in prisons. And a lot of people were talking about prisons disappearing, which we can't even imagine that conversation today. Okay, well, if this was terrible, which I think it is, for whites, it was horrific for African Americans. African Americans are incarcerated at a rate about 5 times that of whites. If you are a marijuana user, your chances of being arrested, let me see how I can put the statistics. White or blacks are 12 to 13% of the population. They are 35% of those who are arrested for drug possession. There are 55% of those convicted for drug possession. And there's 74% of those actually imprisoned for drug possession. Which means that if you are a black drug user, you have somewhere between 13 and 20 times the chance of going to jail than if you're a white person smoking marijuana. It varies. There are a couple of states in which the ratio is 50 times. Alabama, I think, is one. So there's been something, and this has very, very, very little to do with differences in crime rate. There are some specific differences we can talk about, but has nothing to do with these differentials. It has to do with the way the criminal justice system has dealt with African Americans. Almost 10% of all young black men are in jail at any given time. In Washington, 25% of young black males are in jail at every given time. 25% of a quarter of all the black men in the community are in jail. Think of what that might do to a community to take so many black men away. Okay, so the question is, how did that happen? How does it happen? Why does it continue to happen? And to simplify, the basic reason is the war on drugs. And the war on drugs was declared in 1982 when there was no public concern about drugs. 2% of the people polled at that time said that they thought crack was that drugs were an important problem in the country. Crack didn't appear on the streets until 1985. It was 1986 or 7 before there was a major newspaper article on crack. So the drug war was declared before there was a change in drug use and before people were concerned about it. So that when the feds declared this, they actually had to, the fancy word is incentivize, the word I'd use is bribe, local police departments to actually join in the drug war. Because local police departments had to say, well, why should we use all these, the few policemen we have to be going after something, marijuana use, that doesn't really matter to us. But because of the importance that the federal government placed on this, they were offered, local police departments were offered money, they were offered equipment to prosecute this war. So it became quite lucrative for the police department and sometimes for the community to prosecute this drug war. This I find really hard to believe, but that's what happened during the 80s. In fact, over 50% of the increase in the prison population has been due to marijuana possession. Not dangerous drugs, not kingpins, but due to marijuana possession. This has overwhelmingly affected the black population. And so the question is why? Did prosecutors and police purposely, were they purposely prejudiced? Did they go after African Americans? That may have happened in some cases. But there were several other problems. One is that when you go after a crime that lots of people commit, you have to decide who you're going to go after. How many people, I don't know how many people smoke marijuana here on campus, but quite a few. There are, what is 10-15% of people per year who smoke marijuana. So you can't arrest everybody, so you have to decide where to go after it. Well, that kind of discretion on the part of police means that their own maybe unconscious prejudices come in as to who deserves to be arrested and where the best place to arrest people is, which is the inner city for almost all policemen, including black policemen. So almost all of the looking for drug marijuana users happens in the inner city. Do you remember the last time the police were called to the campus to try to find drug users here? doubt that it's happened, at least not recently. It'd be easy to figure out, right? I mean, a lot of people know who the drug users are, but there hasn't been any effort to find the drug users here, I guess. There's a lot of effort in the inner city. Second reason is that prosecutors have an enormous degree of discretion about who they're going to prosecute, what they're going to prosecute them for, and therefore what kind of sentence they're going to get. So prosecutors have almost unlimited authority in this area. A person comes in arrested by the police, the prosecutor has unlimited discretion whether he's going to prosecute that person or not. And nobody checks out that he's not accountable to anybody. If he's going to prosecute, he can prosecute in state court, which has got less penalties, or in federal court, which has greater penalties. He can decide what specific law he's going to charge the person with breaking. Is it possession, or is it a more complicated charge of possession with intent to sell? He can bring in multiple charges. These are all things that he or she can do without any accountability at all. Remember I told you that the judges kind of lost their power because of the mandatory sentencing law. Well, the person who gained the power was the district attorney, because he or she decides what crimes he's going to prosecute you for. So he can prosecute you for simple possession, which may be, 3 months or a sentence, time served or whatever, not very much. Or he can prosecute you for some more serious crime that will involve years in jail. And once again, the unconscious prejudices of district attorneys come into play about how they're going to prosecute things. I won't get into it, but for those of you who kind of feel like this idea of racism is pretty much past and people don't have these unconscious prejudices, there's some very, very good studies that show how deeply prejudiced all of us are against African Americans. It's just something, if you grew up in this society, and there's some tests that will do that. Just one simple one. If you ask white Americans to imagine a drug deal, 95% of them will be black. A drug dealer that they're imagining. So there are other studies like this. So if you give people license to choose or to have absolute authority without any accountability, these unconscious prejudices are just going to come forward. And so both the police and the prosecutor have this, are not accountable for the choices that they make. Finally, the prosecutor is able to negotiate with you what kind of, what you'll be charged for. So if the prosecutor comes to you and says, I'm going to charge you with a crime that has a 15-year drug sentence, mandatory minimum, or I can charge you with a crime that has 2 years in jail. If you'll confess to the crime, I'll charge you just with the two-year sentence. If you won't confess, I'm going to take you to court, and the likelihood is that you'll get a 15-year sentence. So over 90% of convictions are reached through this, what's called plea bargaining. They don't go to trial. So what would you do if you had, that choice? There's a guy in jail now for 50 years who was offered a 1.5-year sentence and refused it because he was innocent. But he was convicted and sent to jail for 50 years. So that's another power that the district attorney has to put folks in jail. I think that's what I want to do, now. The other thing that's happened, which I didn't know about until I read this book a couple of months ago, was that the Supreme Court has had a number of decisions since the early 80s that have severely weakened the Fourth Amendment protections against search and seizure in the case of drug laws. So basically, police can search you anytime they want to. It used to be that they had to have a really, really good reason, or it used to be they had to have a warrant to arrest you. Now they can arrest you for pretty much anything if they suspect you, which has meant, again, we have that non-accountability, and so blacks are targeted for this. If any of you is interested, the book to read about the criminal justice system is called The New Jim Crow, and it's an incredible book. I knew most of the information because I've written about the area too, but I had no idea the extent of it. So it's a good book. It's well researched by a lawyer who's worked in the area. Okay. First of all, questions or comments? What do you think? Does this surprise you? A lot of people find it just unbelievable. So if you feel that way, you're not alone. Comments? Yeah.
My granddad, he's told me so many of these things, like about the prisons and like the how it's populated with black men and all these things. And I'm just like, Granddad, like it's not like that. Like you're crazy. Like you're just overanalyzing, you're overthinking. And now I've heard so much about this, about about the city of Detroit, and there's some city in Richmond that was like predominantly black affluent community, and they like build a bridge or something through it. Like I've heard so much of this, and now I'm just like, it's true, and it's kind of like a slap in the face as well, and it makes me really reevaluate my goals sometimes and the way I view life in a different way, because some of these things that's happening, some people are so ignorant to it they will never know, and not even that they won't know because people know now, but they just will never care because it don't affect them or directly affect people that they care about or love. But I think I really thank you for saying all these things and just putting everything into perspective. And even with you saying all these things kind of affected me, because I have younger cousins and little, like people that I care about. My grandparents always tell them, you better be careful because you're either gonna go to jail or you're gonna get shot, and I'm just like, you guys are so old fashioned. It's not like that anymore, but it really is. It's kind of shocking, but yeah.
Well, I guess my question to you is like all of these societal issues. How's it affected you as a doctor working in poverty medicine?
The injustice of it, I mean, a lot of these people are my friends. We had a home for homeless men with AIDS. I lived there for 3 years and took care of people for 15 years. I won't go into the details, but black men are 9 times as likely to have AIDS as white men. And it's complicated, but that's primarily, we think, it's primarily due to the criminal justice system. So that level of injustice against people I know, it's very emotionally real to me. I mean, as she was saying, when you know people, it becomes a very, very different issue. So for me, it's just really important to tell people about it and to do whatever we can to let people know. I mean, nothing will happen. I mean, part of the reason that, what's your name, ma'am? Lakinda. What Lakinda said, that people don't care. I don't quite think that's true. The problem is that we've got this thing called cognitive dissonance. Do you kind of know what that is? If you believe something and you see something that's against that makes what you believe false, you've got to deal with that cognitive dissonance between the two. And people do not like cognitive dissonance. So they've either got to change their inner perception, their inner belief, or they have to change their perception of what's going on outside. And what happens in so many of us is when we hear things like this, it is so threatening to our whole belief system that we choose to change what we hear, not to listen to it. This is just a human universal trait. And so I don't blame people for not caring. You actually bring people in and kind of show them, and almost anybody will care. That's not always true. Most people will care because it's awful. But it's so easy not to see it because of these unconscious mechanisms that are going on. I mean, once you see it, you got to do something about it. And you just can't stand there and not do anything. So, yes, ma'am.
I guess my question, like, I follow up on that is, what do you believe the solutions to be then to this? Like, even when reading your book, like, do you believe it's more of a government solution or more about what you and your clinic, I guess, did by taking it, like, on a more personal level?
Well, as I'm sure you're aware, that is the polarizing question in the political debate about how to deal with poverty. Is it, do we take care of it personally with charity and with good intention? That's certainly Governor Romney's belief. And he's a sincere man who obviously cares about poverty. He's made that very clear. But he believes that government should not have much of a role in that. I believe that should be done individually. On the other hand, President Obama has a different experience. And he believes that the government has an important role to fill because individual charity won't be enough. For me, the truth is obviously both. Individual charity can't come close to dealing with these issues. If you just take the programs of Medicaid and welfare and then figure out how much money is there, and then take all the church budgets in the country, you have to have them multiplied by 3. All church budgets in the country multiplied by 3, and then all of the difference between the current budget and 2/3 of those increased budgets be given to the poor in order to have enough money just for those programs. So it's not going to happen just through charity. On the other hand, charity is the way that that makes the most sense to us sort of emotionally. You know, if there's something that's wrong, I'm going to try to fix it in any way I can. Politics is kind of out there, and I don't know what to do about it, but if I can go to Joseph's house and give money to it, or work in a soup kitchen or whatever, that at least feels right to me. And I think that's important, because what that does is it educates you. And not only does it help some people, but it opens your eyes to what's going on, so that you then become more willing to look at these structural causes and think about the proper role of government, whether you're a conservative or a liberal, to think about what the proper role of government in this. So for me, it's both. And for people who believe it's just government, I don't think that's a good answer either, because you have to have some personal experience with that. You have to have done some charity work in order to know enough to be able to develop programs.
Do you believe then someone like you would be like a greater asset to the government in like developing a program that would more like acutely attack the problems?
Specifically like me?
Like, well, I mean, you've had like a wide range of experiences, and you've dealt with like not only that healthcare issues, but you've gotten to know people. So I feel like someone like you, do you feel like you'd be helpful?
No, where I would be helpful is in testifying, in writing, in educating other people, because that's a gift I have. My level of administrative ability is I would be a terrible administrator. Yes, read it.
I just wanted to add a book to your list, and that is a book for people interested in the history of Richmond itself. And that is a book called Richmond's Unhealed History by Ben Campbell. And so if you're interested in hearing the same story that you heard Dr. Hilfiker tell about the city we are living in, that's a good book for you.
By the way, this history of the inner city that I gave you earlier on, that's not a liberal or conservative story. That's just what you find. There aren't that many history books written about poverty, but anyone you go to, you get the same story. This is not sort of a liberal or conservative bias. I wrote a little book called Urban Poverty, and I was just really, really careful to only put information in there that was objectively true. Yes, ma'am.
How would you say is a good way to deal with actually balancing empathy? Like being in this situation where you interact with people who are struggling and it becomes personal. And I know like I'm a big empathizer and I feel like really hard about certain things. And I feel like that's going to be one of my downfalls. So I'm trying to like figure out how I can.
You mean as a professional?
Yeah, especially as a medical professional, but just in any job, like how do you balance how much empathy you have?
Yeah. So the question is, how do you balance this personal involvement, this empathy, with the professional requirements that you have? As a doctor, you will be told, do not get yourself personally involved with a patient. It will interfere with your care. That's what the rule is. I disagree with that, in that I think it's important to be involved. But you have to learn organically how to do it without it interfering with your care. It's something I couldn't tell you. Just a little story. At Joseph's house, this is our home for homeless men with AIDS, where they live and then die with us. When a new nurse comes to work with us, she inevitably falls in love with one of the guys within months, you know. And so when that guy dies, she is just overwhelmed by it because this person's been so important in her life. She's been so open to him. And that may happen even the second time. But then what happens is that she learns how to protect a part of herself while still remaining open to the person. In other words, she learns it organically, so that she just doesn't have to have a rule that I'm not allowed to be emotionally involved with this person, but that she can still be emotionally involved with the person up to the place where she knows it's going to hurt her or hurt the relationship. So I think it's possible to learn that. It's just a little painful. And you know, your supervisors may not go for it either, so you may. But I think it is possible, and I think it's important to care about your patient and not be overwhelmed by that caring, but to care, so that your patient knows that you care. I mean, that's at least one good reason for it. I mean, knowing that you care is half of what you can do as a doctor. You know? So I think it's important, but there's no prescription for it. And it's not, I'm a minority opinion.